Welcome, welcome. Take a seat. This is where we continue our marathon of specs to look at from a different perspective. After going through many videos about ratings, rankings, tier lists with objective and impartial evaluations of the specs, now it's time to go more for gut reaction, for feeling, for intuition and premonition about certain specs and how they might perform. This is a safe space. We don't need data, we don't need statistics, we don't need theory crafting. The only thing we need is our fifth sense. The fifth sense on whether or not we do believe a certain spec will overperform or underperform. We don't need hard evidence, we don't need proof, we just need our own intuition. Let's just start by excluding some of the weaker specs and some of the more average specs that I don't think will change that much. When we look at how the specs have been performing, how the specs are expected to perform by most people, you have Raid and Mythic Plus, where most of the specs are expected to be on a similar level for both activities, Survival, Feral, Arms and Fury. You have the three specs at the top that have performed the best throughout the beta, which is Frost, Havoc and Subtlety, and then you have some of the changes being Windwalker and Outlaw performing better in AoE-centered scenarios like Mythic Plus compared to Raids. Now, looking at these lists, not much to say about Feral, not much to say about Survival, as well as Arms and Fury. I don't think there is much of any risky call to make about these specs. I think they are correctly represented, for better or for worse. I think they are where they are supposed to be. Now, looking at some of the bold claims I want to do about MeleeDPS. So the first one I'm going over is Ret Paladin. The most recent spec I've gone over for MeleeDPS, I've already talked about it at length in the video, with the addition of the second burst window that has been given to them through Execution Sentence, Final Reckoning, as well as Seraphim and the Kyrian Covenant, Divine Toll. I think it has made them way more powerful than before. So Ret Paladin in BFA, it's not that they were weak, right? Ret Paladin, it's not that they had Windwalker Monk, Survival Hunter, Feral Druid levels of reputation in the community. They weren't completely ignored. They were doing fine. They were middle of the pack. It wasn't weird to see a Ret Paladin in a raid group. It wasn't weird to see a Ret Paladin in a Mythic Plus group. But just they weren't good enough to make, the cut to be one tier above, to be considered for the actual, better MeleeDPS specs. In BFA, I already thought they were suffering from some negative community perception that made them less wanted compared to their actual power. But in Shadowlands, I do think they're going to do much better. I do put a ton of value, I am underlining this, a ton of value in your ability to split your damage. To make this very clear, if you could choose between having a 40-second long burst or 4 different 10-second bursts, you would always go for 4 different 10-second burst windows. Because this means you can tailor them to the encounter. You can tailor them to the Mythic Plus pools. So the more split your burst is, the stronger you will be in every single encounter. Even if, just to make you understand, even if your single 40-second burst does double damage than your 4 different 10-second bursts. The 4 different 10-second bursts will still be stronger, even if they're doing half the damage, because you can use them in every single window, in every single damage window. Of course, if there is an encounter that requires a 40-second burst, then the single very long burst is going to be king. But that's not the case in Mythic Plus, it's not the case in raid encounters. In raid encounters, you want to burst the boss when there is, a damage buff on you or a debuff on the boss, and then 45 seconds later there is an important ad spawning and you want to do some damage on it, and then you want to go back to the boss in a very good window where you're using your Bloodlust. This is why I'm putting so much importance on the second burst window of Ret Paladin, and why I think it is going to be much better than it was in BFA. Even before all of the talent changes, the new abilities being given baseline, the legendaries and the conduits and all of that, the real important thing is the way in which they can use their burst, which has gotten better. Yes, this argument is still going to count even after they got nerfed. Exactly to what I've been talking about, their burst. Execution Sentence nerfed, Final Reckoning extra damage nerfed, and their key conduit Virtuous Command nerfed. I still think it's not going to change the fact that they have a very good chance of being one of the better MeleeDPS specs for Shadowlands, considered by the community and actually by performance to be one of the better specs. The next melee spec on the block is going to be Death Knight as a whole. The reason why I'm putting Death Knight here is because I have been listing at length that Frost is going to be the better spec than Unholy for both Mythic Plus and Raids. I have made an overview of Unholy DK, where I also pointed this out, the MeleeDPS rankings for Castlanathria, the ones for Mythic Plus, and the answer was still the same. The general consensus also, when you look around, is giving Frost higher chances of being better. So this is technically a prediction based on facts, based on stats and numbers. The reason why it's still here, regardless, is because the community perception is different. Most of you don't have the Shadowlands beta, so most of you are going to gauge the strength of the specs given by the pre-patch. And what the pre-patch is telling us is that Unholy DK is much more popular than Frost DK, as well as out-damaging and outperforming Frost DK in both Mythic Plus and Raid encounters. And there is going to be an hostile takeover when Shadowlands comes in, because I do believe Frost DK is going to outperform Unholy in basically all facets of the game when it comes to PvE, for similar reasons to Red Paladin. Even before looking at the actual damage they do, just how much they do, what comes first is the fact that they have enough cooldowns and enough variety of cooldowns that they can tune them, they can fine-tune them for all different types of fights and encounters. Cooldowns every minute, every 2 minutes, every 45 seconds, they can just, tinker with them and always have them active to have bursts of damage when the important damage is necessary. From Frostwyrm's Fury, now baseline, to of course Breath of Sindragosa, Empowered Rune Weapon, Pillar of Frost, Remorseless Winter, their Covenant ability. They have a wide list of ways for them to do damage. What's even better is that now they have the two-handed Obliterate build for single target and the dual-wielding Breath of Sindragosa build for AoE, which is also going to be extremely powerful. Never before seen, as a matter of fact. Your Breath of Sindragosa, very popular AoE build, would make you rather weak in a pure single target fight like Sludge Fist, but hey, you can just equip a two-hander and switch to Obliterate single target. You can switch your legendary to one of the single target focused ones, and now you're a much better single target spec. So on top of having a wide array of cooldowns to choose from, they can also even switch their damage profile from AoE to single target based on the weapons they are using. And this is why they end up here. They have been mentioned quite a few times by, good players, experienced players, Theorycrafting players as being better than Unholy, but I don't think there is enough of a spotlight on this. I don't think it's being recognized enough. So that's why they end up in this video. The next call I feel like making, the next prediction I feel like making is that despite all of the positive changes and the positive feedback that the rework of Enhancement Shaman has received, I don't think it's going to shift too much the state of Enhancement Shaman within the perception of the community and the actual strength of the spec compared to others. I think Enhancement in BFA has been essentially a tier below Ret when it came to power and when it came to recognition and perception of the player base. It was considered a weaker spec, and it was considered definitely unorthodox and more alternative to see an Enhancement Shaman in a raid or an Enhancement Shaman in a Mythic Plus group. So it does sound weird to say they have gotten changed for the better, they have gotten many positive changes, and the spec now is more enjoyable to play and is more smooth and flows better, but then the result is still the same, right? One of the problems is of course their lack of burst. Months ago, Blizzard mentioned they were going to fix Feral Spirits. They did, and the fix was not enough. The cooldown in and of itself is still too weak. They have a lot of systems they have to keep up. They have a lot of things they have to keep in mind, from spreading and refreshing their Flame Shock, alternating that cooldown with doing single target damage with Frost Shock. They can go for Hailstorm for more AoE with their Frost Shock. Then they also have to keep up the CD of their Storm Strike and the CD of their Lava Lash. They have a lot of systems that they have to keep up, and the negative DPS, the DPS loss for messing up the system, hurts them quite a bit. And this is unlike many other melee specs who don't really suffer as much from making all of these mistakes, and their payoff is much higher. Enhancement Shaman has to build up their Maelstrom stacks, they have to put Crush Lightning on the ground, use at least a couple of different CDs, ready for their AoE burst, and even when they do it perfectly, their burst, either single target or AoE, isn't even that high right now. So my prediction, my feeling, without any data to back it up, is that while all the positive changes have gone through and it's more enjoyable to play, I don't think it is going to shift the way people see Enhancement and the way Enhancement actually performs. I think maybe they can move from their Enhancement tier they were in BFA into the Red Paladin tier of BFA. Maybe it's going to be a little bit more normal and standard to see an Enhancement in a group, but it will still be considered, an alternative pick compared to other more popular options. I will close with the same thing I've closed with every single enhancement video, which is that they might still be S tier, you know, very, very popular and good in raid encounters if Wind Fury Totem becomes mandatory. You know, that would just make seeing one enhancement in every single raid the norm. And that would bump up the perception and the evaluation that people have towards enhancement greatly, because it's going to be a mandatory spec. So feels bad if you're enhancement to have to hope that a raid utility is what makes you very wanted, but I do believe that's what's going to be the case. And the last of my calls for MeleeDPS is regarding Rogue. So it is not uncommon to see a pure DPS class to have one of their specs cannibalize the rest, right? It is not uncommon to see that if Fire Mage is meta, then the Arcane and the Frost population is going to drop to the ground. Not uncommon to see if Assassination is the to-go spec in raids, then there is going to be less than 1% of Subtlety players. This happens quite often, right? We have seen this already when Frost was very popular, nobody was playing Fire. And then when Fire became popular, nobody was playing Frost, right? It's just what happens in pure DPS classes. However, when it comes to Rogue, you have seen by this point pretty much everywhere the fact that Subtlety has been rated very highly by everyone, right? By this point, even in the pre-patch, you have seen a massive rise of sub-players, despite the fact that Subtlety was basically dead for the entirety of BFA, except for Zul. My call is that even with this perceived notion that Subtlety is going to be super powerful, I just showed you myself some rankings where sub is basically at the top in all of them, but I still think the player base, the play rates of Subtlety are not going to reflect their strength. Meaning there is still going to be a lot of Assassination and Outlaw players. This is because of two reasons. Number one, the fact that Subtlety is strong doesn't make Assassination weak or Outlaw weak in the two respective game modes. Assassination for raid encounters and Outlaw for Mythic Plus. They are just a tier below in performance. The difference is that I do believe Subtlety is a little bit more of a divisive and polarizing spec. I think their playstyle is significantly harder than Assassination and Outlaw. It has been, you know, simplified over time, but it is still a ways away from being as simple as, for example, Outlaw. And I do think that there are many Rogue players that enjoy or settled in the playstyles of Assassination and Outlaw. You know, Assassination is much slower than Subtlety, a lot more pooling, a lot more waiting around resources, whereas Outlaw is much more straightforward. It's not necessarily slow, it's just Sinister Strike into dispatch, Sinister Strike into dispatch, Sinister Strike into dispatch, and that's your burst, you know. It's not that complicated. Which is why I think even with the strength of Subtlety, it's not going to completely take over the Rogue specs. I think there are quite some Rogues that just don't like the way Subtlety plays. They are accustomed and they are comfortable around simpler and easier specs to execute than Subtlety. So even if Subtlety were to be stronger, you know, given with the fact that Outlaw will still be strong in AoE and Mythic Plus, and Assassination will still be strong in single target, many people will just, you know, settle with Assassination or settle with Outlaw, rather than making the jump, the shift to Subtlety. So I think that while Subtlety deserves the recognition for being extremely powerful right now, I don't think it is going to have a one-to-one translation into play rates for the spec. I think the whole class as Rogue is going to be more balanced in terms of spread of player base for all three specs, and not just be a Subtlety fest, at least for the first tier, for the first season of Shadowlands. And these were all the calls and predictions I wanted to make about MeleeDPS. MeleeDPS, out of all of the 4 roles, was the ones I had the least amount of visions, the least amount of prophecies about. I think it is more correctly represented in terms of their power, in terms of their predicted performance, compared to healers, tanks, and range DPS. It is more straightforward, I believe. As I mentioned, I don't think there is anything to be surprised about or to be speculating about for Survival, Feral, Arms, and Fury. You know, there isn't much there, I don't think. So now, the only one we have left is the range DPS, last one. That's where I think more bold calls can be made about quite a few specs. We'll see later on. Tell me what you guys think, your theories, your predictions, your premonitions, the dreams you had last night about one of these specs being a hidden gem, an underrated OP spec. So, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, flute!